Oh, they will need, yes, for sure, yes. 2 between 3.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, folks, thanks for coming today. We're here to discuss the question of really what is a bike and how large should bikes be. But the event is called Beer Bike Bust. What was the title? Reject or no? Outlaw bigger bikes or embrace them. And the reason for that, or the hook we hung that on, was the fact that a beer bike was seized in Leith Walk about 3 months ago, a car-sized beer bike. And the police haven't actually said why they did that, which is very interesting. I've inquired. I've spoken to the guy who was the driver at the time. I've spoken to the owner of the bike, who runs a company from Slovakia, running these bikes in cities all over Europe. And they're all being very quiet about exactly what the dispute is. So we can touch on that and why that might be the case. But first, I want my guests to just say a sentence or two about themselves and what their interest and expertise is in this. So, Jodie?
I'm Jodie Gordon, and I am a partner at Outlaw Scotland. So we are a personal injury firm who represent cyclists who've been injured on the road. So I'm here from a kind of legal and civil standpoint.
I'm Victoria Hawkins. I'm really just here as a parent, and my children participate in one of the local bike buses, and I think it'd be quite fun to for the children to actually be able to ride a bike bus and not just their individual bikes, and that would encourage active travel to school and also be fun and social for the children.
Hi, I'm Alex Fitzhowell. During the pandemic, I started a cargo bike logistics company in Edinburgh called Far Out Deliveries. And very recently, I've started working for Zedify, who are the UK market leader for cycle logistics.
So when the market leader takes an interest, we know it's happening in this city. So I'll come to you first, Jodie. I want you to wildly speculate on some reason do you think the police might have suspected that there was a problem with a bike with 12 drunks and 1 sober person the size of a transit van careering down Leith Walk?
Well, the first one that obviously springs to mind is whether it is cycling under the influence of alcohol. Even though there is a designated driver, as it were, the other people are still pedalling, so they're still cycling. So it could, in theory, fall under that category, or careless or inconsiderate cycling, depending what their conduct was, how they were on the road. Thirdly, I guess it can also be a misunderstanding from the police perspective. If they've not seen a vehicle like that on the roads, then they would, of course, pull it over and potentially seize it before they actually look into a huge amount of information about it. So I don't know exactly which one, but I would have speculated potentially one of the first two.
And there are also obviously potentially technical grounds.
Yes, yeah, of course. Obviously, I certainly don't know anything about kind of the vehicle that was being used in terms of the bike bus. The beer bike. I've seen them in other cities, but haven't seen them in Edinburgh, so I don't know anything about how it was set up and anything like that. So it's difficult to speculate, but there would be a number of grounds that the police could potentially have seized on. It would have been helpful if the police or the company had stated what that was, so then we could obviously look into that in a bit more detail. Is it an issue for cargo type bikes generally, or is it specific to the fact that they were drinking while they were pedalling this? We don't know.
We'll come back to some of these questions in more detail. So, Victoria, we heard that local residents were none too pleased and had actually called the police in on this. Can you talk about what fears you might have, or whether you want these bikes all over the place, in terms of your children and others?
I don't see a particular issue with there being bikes like this, as long as they're legal. I don't see a particular risk in terms of pedestrians, including kids, particularly if there is somebody who is kind of like sober and in charge. But yeah, I mean, I suppose there might be some noise associated with it. There's a lot of stag parties in Edinburgh, and there can be complaints about that. But if we're going to go down that route, then, you know, are we banning stag parties? Like, I don't, or hen parties for balance. But, you know, sort of, is that what the issue is? That, you know, what the bike was being used for, as opposed to the actual detail of the bike and the safety aspects of it.
And it does seem clear that perhaps bicycles going at 15 miles an hour and less are not really very much of a danger by comparison with the cars that are choking the city.
Yeah, I find it interesting how we very much focus on kind of like bikes and the speed that bikes are doing, when cars are going a lot faster, they're a lot heavier as well. So, you know, the impact of that speed and weight on a pedestrian, and, you know, particularly children, you know, is so much greater from a car than it is from, you know, the bicycles that we currently have.
Okay, thanks. So, Alex, do you feel that this is in any way a threat to what you do, or could it ever impinge on what you do?
Yeah, obviously a lot of this is speculative because we don't know exactly why it was stopped, but I do remember seeing it around town, and it is, I don't know how wide it was, but it was probably not much wider than some of the cargo bikes that we do have going around the city at the moment. So if it was in a sense of it's taking up too much space, then yeah, potentially that backlash could feel like it's coming for us, you know. But all of our vehicles are kept within, well within the limits of what a bike path is width-wise. And, you know, I was perfectly able to filter on my way here through gridlock traffic on one side and a bus stop on the other, and, you know, can get through like on any other bike, even with a huge box on.
And do you find that you ever have any citizen objection to your bikes driving around?
Confusion more than objection, I would say. You definitely get some double takes, particularly from people that haven't seen them before. You get a lot of curiosity, a lot of amazement. Some people want to have a go. Sometimes they'll try while you're not on it, and you have to run back quickly. Yeah, people are very curious about them. I definitely would say it's generally more positive than negative. But yeah, it will take a bit of getting used to as things expand.
So we'll come back to some of the sort of detailed legalistic parameters, but I've got a list that I've written down, I won't read it out, of probably about 10 or 12 different potential reasons, some of which are the ones you said, behavioural ones. But I'm wondering if that is perhaps ruled out because they've seized and kept the bike. If it was just bad behaviour, the bike itself wouldn't be considered dangerous or illegal in some way. And other possibilities might be something that a vehicle of that size doesn't have indicators, or the police thought it should be registered and it's not, you know, confusion about what actually is a motor vehicle. So I'm wondering, do we need changes, do you think, in the law to draw lines around these things? Because they're going to come, probably.
Yeah, we already know that the law is behind the changes that are being made within the kind of bicycle sector, as it were, in terms of, obviously there are restrictions in respect of e-bikes, there are consultation in terms of how that should or shouldn't be changed. And yes, we know e-scooters are the other thing, that they're not legalised yet, but there's discussions around that and safety, where those riders should and shouldn't be. So absolutely the law needs to catch up, especially when you're pairing that with issues around climate change. You can't expect them to be able to reduce emissions. And obviously now in Edinburgh we've got the low emission zone, but there's companies that still need to have deliveries. So the obvious thing is moving towards cargo type bikes. So you can then get those deliveries into where they need to be in these low emission zones. So yes, absolutely, the law needs to catch up with what is actually happening in real cities in real time. We know that doesn't happen quickly, and we also know there is a lot of confusion, and that in some ways, we touched on that before in terms of what cars are able to do, yet there seems to be some terrifying thought that if you increase what those restrictions are on e-bikes, then suddenly there's going to be vigilantes going around killing people on their bike. I don't know where that misconception has come from. Obviously, there are people that cycle badly in the same way that there are people that drive badly. There are pedestrians that walk badly. So this idea that you penalise one group and don't allow for bigger motors on bicycles so that cargo bikes can then be better equipped to service the cities, as I say, where that's coming from, and obviously it has to come from the top down effectively in terms of legislation. But yeah, in short, it definitely is well behind where it needs to be.
And just to detour for a moment into the cultural issues here, Victoria, do you experience any objection or wanting to shut down the bike buses? We should explain that the bike buses, many children on their own bikes altogether, and the kind of bike bus you're talking about is like a beer bike, only a bonsai beer bike with no beer.
I think the participants might be the bonsai part of that. No, I mean, my understanding is there's quite a lot of demand for bike buses from parents, and that there's actually quite a lot of support within the council for that as well, and that they would like there to be more bike buses. They are only a temporary solution to children getting to school safely, but at the moment they're the best solution that we kind of have. No, I don't think that there is any objection to bike buses. I mean, well, I say that as a parent with children at the school and wanting them to get to school actively and socially with their friends and environmentally. If I look at it from the perspective of the drivers who encounter the bike bus, then, as you were saying, not everybody drives in a brilliant way, and there have been one or two incidences on the rides, and sometimes the police have got involved with that.
So the children's bike buses as currently run take up more space than a beer bike. Is that fair to say? Wider and longer? So I'm wondering, is there something about children that diffuses the problem of bigness, taking up lots of street space?
Oh, now that's an interesting one.
Disabled bikes as well. I have a side-by-side trike, which is 1.2 metres wide, which is wider than is theoretically, and we'll come back to this, allowed in a bike lane. I have never heard anywhere in the world at all an objection to a disabled bike like that. So it's something about the people riding it or the activity, maybe? Do you find passers-by like to see the kids having fun?
I think generally we do get quite a good response, and I think most people are supportive of children being able to get to school actively. I do think that there are some things that would be different with a bike bus, as in an actual sort of bicycle that the kids were all riding together as opposed to individually being on bikes. And that actually, I think it would make it safer in some ways, because I think other users of the road would see that as a vehicle like any other vehicle, and be less inclined to think that they can overtake. At the moment, what we have is, because it's a group of individual cyclists, or kids on bikes, let's be honest, they're not cyclists. Cars can sometimes overtake, thinking that if there's a car coming towards them, they can just push the collective group out of the way, and they wouldn't be able to do that with, a kind of like a bigger bike.
So you're an optimist, really? Because, I mean, it's to pick up on what Jodie said about people cycling and driving badly. And what I always reply to motorists who get annoyed is, what you're objecting to is idiots, not the vehicle. And idiots don't have a favoured form of transport. They use all the different forms of transport. So you'll probably still get people, I would guess, driving dangerously near. And we need a different name. We need to distinguish these things. You've stolen the word bike bus. But so would you say that you have never seen a driver behaving badly around children?
Oh, definitely. Like, I see drivers behaving badly around children all the time, and that's whether I am walking or on a bike. Unfortunately, it does seem to be getting worse, and it's also more threatening to children because the size of the vehicles now are so much bigger, to the point that I'm an adult female, and like the bonnets are now at my head height. I find that quite intimidating as an adult, so I can't imagine what it feels like as a small child.
Terrifying. Alex, let's look at Edinburgh, the bicycle culture of Edinburgh, and look about what you would like to see as the future in terms of cargo logistics, the growth of your business. What would you like the city to do?
Yeah, I think it was kind of mentioned earlier, with sort of low emission zones coming in. I think one of the things that is being suggested in cities across the UK and Europe and elsewhere is that those areas in particular are prioritised for the introduction of cyclologistics, whether it's mandatory or subsidised or just cooperative between different companies and the local authority, whether that's incentives given to businesses and individuals to get a discount off their services, a subsidy towards their own bike, or if it's for larger companies, it's giving them like flat land, like whether it's a car park, you know, at Murrayfield or something like that, for example, and saying, you know, this is your consolidation point, you can come in here, and then we'll give you this space to run your bikes out of to get into the last mile into the city centre. So, you know, schemes like that, which all have to be really collaborative, but also will need funding, because initially it will be an expensive endeavour. You know, it's much cheaper to run a bike than it is to run a van, but obviously real estate is a premium in capital cities, and as we sort of discourage driving as much as possible, park and rides will be fuller. So, you know, things like taking over car parks may or may not work. It depends, you know. So I think making it stricter within low emission zones and then slowly expanding those areas to where they're most useful. Yeah, I know like a lot of our customers over the years have come in because they're getting ready for low emission zones coming in, and they know their vehicles aren't compliant, or they're just so dissatisfied with spending such a large proportion of their day as a business owner or manager or whoever sitting in traffic. So, you know, when they see that there is an alternative, they're really excited to explore it.
And have you had conversations with the city and the transport planners? Because it sounds like you feel they need to work with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
To roll out the infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, so in other cities, it's been done in various ways. Yeah, they've either just given the support of land to work from, or they've coordinated schemes that have involved a number of businesses, or they've given funding to like a business improvement district, for example. So here we've got Essential Edinburgh for the sort of Newtown area. So, you know, they could be funded via a local authority to then work with their member businesses to offer schemes like this. Also, when construction is being done to change an area of the city, the council is kind of obligated to provide an alternative for affected areas. So when Leith Walk was being, I'm not using this as a stellar example, But when Leith Walk was being worked on to put the trams in, the council did put in these consolidation hubs on the side streets, had containers, trolleys and staff manned at specific hours to support businesses doing that last bit when there was fencing up in front of their shop. I know there was a lot of negative experiences of that, but it definitely can be done better. And when things like Meadows to George Street happen, and when George Street projects happen and things like that, yeah, we'll be there to support if asked.
Okay, I'll open to questions in a minute, but I just wanted to ask you briefly, Jodie, does the city have, what power does the city have to constrain larger, wider, longer, heavier bikes? We know there's national legislation, we'll come to that later, but are there any powers that you're aware of that the city can stop beer bikes?
No, I think it would have to come at a national level. I don't think they'd be able to do that from a council level. I could be wrong, but I don't believe they would. Obviously, in terms of infrastructure, the council can choose how they implement that. But then the difficulty you have is if you restrict the width, then what you discussed earlier, if then disability bikes can't get through, then that creates a different issue. So the only way they would be able to restrict it would be through infrastructure that I can think of. Yeah. But as I say, it would have a knock-on impact to other people using that infrastructure as well. So
we might never have thought, but the exact distance between bollards is quite political, really, which is an odd thought. But, you know, you've got the 1 metre restriction that the EU is thinking of bringing in. There isn't really one in Britain, but there's a kind of informal agreement. It's about that big. Some of these disability bikes are 1.2 metres. In New York, they've just put in a set of regulations allowing cargo bikes up to 4 feet wide, which is, you know, almost as wide as a car. So, you know, where do we put our bollards? And I'm not aware of quite whether the city's got to grips with that, because it restricts very much what can happen. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And we see poor infrastructure in the city all the time in terms of, obviously, it started maybe with good intentions with spaces for people. There was spaces for people, infrastructure right outside here, that then the next thing it was taken away because actually it was causing more issue than anything else. So there needs to be better planning as to who's actually using these routes and what type of vehicles, effectively, in terms of cargo bikes, different types of bicycles are needing to access it. Yeah. And I think that it isn't happening as a full conversation at the moment, and that needs to.
The inconsistency as well between where infrastructure, the widths of different bits of infrastructure make route planning for anyone on 2, 3 or 4 wheels really, really difficult. Because if, like you say, bollards about this wide, but that varies drastically. So, you know, you'll be going down one street and at one end you can fit through the bollards and at the other end you can't. And it's probably just someone's human error, realistically, or they were just built at different time periods and the standard was different.
So we're going to talk in the second half about the, you know, sustainability and emissions issues and so on. But basically, if those bollards are relatively generously spaced, you could do more because you can take your wider vehicles down.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, it's part of the selling point of cargo bikes in general, is that in theory we should be able to get you closer to the door of wherever you're going. Whether it's because it's a mixed use space, like it's partly pedestrianised, but bikes can go in it, or if it's, you know, it's a square, there's a plaza, there's a huge bit of something outside the office block. And I mean, often one of the issues we have is that the operators of some larger buildings and larger organisations aren't quite up to speed with how many cargo bikes are going to be coming, that you're not allowed into loading bays because of safety regulations or insurance or whatever excuse they're giving at the time, because they don't believe you have the ability to brake going down a ramp. I've been told that. So, you know, we have to go to the front of these buildings, but we can't because we're on a bike. Not that we should have to. But.
And just on the point of comparison, if anyone's got any questions, please say so in a second. But you say the wave of cargo bikes coming. Copenhagen is just a little bit bigger than Edinburgh. They have 40,000 cargo bikes alone.
So, just on Copenhagen, we have friends that run cargo bike delivery companies there, and you know, the prevalence of cargo bikes there. First of all, they've got a lot of manufacturers, so some of the bikes that we were using were made there, quite a lot of them. But you know, they have customers who will call up and specifically request a model of bike because they know the capacity. They're so familiar with cargo bikes that they'll request a model of bike because they know the shape and the weight it can take and how fast it will go and all these things.
Yeah, yeah. Any questions? Go on. Please, can we get the microphone to you?
Hi there. Moved fairly recently to Edinburgh, so might need people to fact check me, but having spoken to my local bike mechanic guy who was part of a group who had sort of people carriers, cycle people carriers about 10 years ago or something in Edinburgh, there was some, he had mentioned in a fleeting moment, that they were prevented from using them further by Edinburgh City Council or something like that after an accident of some sort happened. Obviously, this is incredibly vague, so apologies for that. But does anyone have any information about that, and is that potentially at all possible in kind of the workings of the law with Edinburgh City Council?
So I'm just slightly joining 2 and 2 and making 5 here, but I vaguely recall that this was about tricycle rickshaws, that they were carrying speakers and making a lot of noise, charging revellers. No, Kim will know better because he's been, but I also understand that the taxi industry in Edinburgh many years ago got a bylaw in which said a taxi has to have 4 wheels, and that's one of the grounds, I understand, on which they restricted them. But Kim?
So the case was, it was an ex-serviceman or serving serviceman who was drunk, who saw friends and tried to jump out of the bike backwards, hit his head and killed himself. So what it was death by misadventure. But the taxi industry objected, so they pushed for bylaws to be brought in to restrict the use of trishaws, and they had to have a street trader's license to take money on the trishaws, and that was what was restricting them. And they brought in all sorts of strange regulations about the bikes, which they tried to push through under the street trading regulation to restrict it. It was basically just restricted practice by the taxi operators.
So it's a combination of vested interests and hysteria about the danger of bikes.
Yeah, I mean there was no real issue of danger there. They made them put covers over the spokes in case somebody had a long scarf and got their scarf caught in the wheel or something. It was just a hysterical reaction, really.
And as someone who's been advocating for this for a long time, do you think the city needs to give its head a wobble and sort this out so that we can have these vehicles?
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, the trishaws they used, actually, you know, they're the basis of the cargo bikes that Alex is now using with Zedify, because Charlie, who runs Zedify, or who's the Scottish manager for Zedify, bought a load of the things off of Protopedal, who sold them off their fleet. And they converted them. They didn't used to even have electric assist, so they're very low-geared bikes, and very fit riders would carry huge American tourists up the mound on these things. Were they a threat to the taxi trade? Probably not, because most people taking taxi want to get faster. These were taken for entertainment value. Yeah. So it's all a mix of things, and it's a fear of competition from certain groups.
And it seems somewhat crazy to me that we're going to be closing off a lot of the streets to through car traffic, and the streets are so thronged in summer, and they still will be with cars bringing tourists in the summer, and yet bikes like that could help to resolve that problem.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at every other city in Europe that's progressive, they are closing down streets to motor traffic simply because there isn't the space for them. Cars are incredibly space-hogging, taking a huge amount of space. And you see city across Europe, you see the slide there, they're running these sort of rickshaw things, which are effective ways to get around. In London, they've got the pedal me bikes, which is a modified version of the one I've got at the back there, which people sit along a bench seat in the front. Very efficient. they can get people around quite easily. Why we're not having that? I mean, the tourists don't come to visit a car park. And I've met tourists for several years, saying, is there a nice quiet way to get to the centre of the city? Because they don't want to walk through the cars.
Yeah.
You go outside this building and people standing in the road taking photographs are upset by the fact that the cars are trying to run them down. It's crazy. It should all be pedestrianised.
So what we're saying is that our city clearly has a problem and a need to readjust its attitude here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Anyone else want to ask a question? Please.
Richard Curley, I'm interested because I think there's a kind of global perspective to this, which is that in different countries, different wheeled vehicles are treated in a variety of curious ways. So, for example, there's a model of car in France that you can drive when you're 14.
Voiture sans permis.
Is that what it's called? I'll defer to your greater familiarity. What I'm interested in is set aside the fact that in all modes of transport there are the stupid and the malicious who will potentially cause an accident or take a high risk. But what I'm looking at in the screen and at the back there is increasingly heavier wheeled vehicles. I cycled here. If I hit somebody, I'm not going to do a great deal of harm to them. But if somebody hits me on Middle Meadow Walk in the dark with something like that, and they're doing 20 miles an hour, they're going to do a great deal of harm to me. And you just have to walk around at night and not look over your shoulder to see the food delivery drivers whizzing along on quite heavy vehicles. And I'm just not sure how we handle that legally. I think you're right, Jody, that it's a statewide legislative requirement. It's not something that the city council can do a great deal about. It can facilitate, but it can't ban. And I'm intrigued to know why.
So I'll put that to Victoria as the advocate here of large crowds of kids careering around on bikes. Sober. How can you compromise with someone who's afraid of large bikes then?
Well, I mean, some kind of bike bus would be in daylight. I mean, I don't know. My impression was that we're not talking about anything going faster than 15 miles an hour. So there's a speed element and a difference between heavy vehicles that are capable of going at like high speeds, which we currently have on our streets, and bigger bikes that are limited to 15 miles an hour. I mean, I don't know that a bike bus would particularly be a threat. I'm not entirely sure that that's really the scenario that you were thinking of. And mostly certainly the bike bus at the moment goes along the roads. It's not going along paths that people might be using to walk along. And I would envisage that, if there was a more vehicle-style bike bus, that, the point is that would also be on the road and in daylight and not going along, pedestrianised areas.
So those sorts of bikes that you've been talking about for children exist in the Netherlands. So watch this space.
I hope so.
Alex, do you want to say something?
I think the concerns around heavier bikes in shared spaces is not unfounded, but I think mitigation can be taken. I think we all are picturing kind of worst case scenario, which is good to think about, obviously, and when we're all familiar with the unusual bike infrastructure in Edinburgh being used by the sort of converted illegal electric bikes at all hours of the day, often riding quite recklessly without lights a lot of the time, which, for the record, is multiple crimes have been committed there. So really, is that an enforcement problem? Probably. They should have lights. They shouldn't be allowed to be assisted over 15, etc. But the really larger ones, first of all, the barrier for entry is high. They're costly. They're an expensive thing to purchase. An individual is unlikely to have one. So the odds are high that they're going to be working for a company at the moment, and then that company is not legally required to, but should have fairly stringent training procedures. The Bicycle Association, which is the UK's sort of largest members advocacy group, Trade Association, sorry, thank you. They have a special committee on psychologistics, which was made by absorbing another group. I sit on that discussion group, and together with a number of cargo bike operators and other organisations, they have worked out a draft code of conduct and training standard, which was kind of an amalgamation of various people's existing internal documents. And I think that is kind of being shown to legislators as a suggested, this is what we could have in place if you wanted to put some rules in place for operators like ourselves. But at present, we have, a person on our team whose one of his primary roles is developing in-house training. So at the moment it's around it's the delivery method of the sort of level 1, 2, 3 bikeability, which everyone is trained to that ability. Otherwise, you can't ride for the company. And that training is done on a cargo bike. It's not sort of retroactive. And that's like the minimum training. And I know there are other companies that have their own training standards that they're working towards. So it is quite rigorous, and incidents are reported and disciplinary is taken and all these kind of things. There's indicators and lights, and the brakes are more heavy duty than a regular bike, and all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, absolutely, it is currently kind of left a little up to people to make the right choices, and hire well and train well and all this kind of thing. So there is room in there for improvement. And yeah, sorry, that was I hope that helped.
Okay, I think we'll take our break now. Thank you very much. And Victoria, you'll be departing and you'll be replaced by someone else. So thank you very much for now, and we'll be back in 10 minutes. Small audience, but I felt that was a good... Coming back now for the second half, and we're going to now take a look at broader issues beyond just Edinburgh, looking at national and global issues to do with ever more larger bikes. And we have on the platform Jim Densham, who's going to tell us a little about himself.
Yeah, my name's Jim. I'm a policy manager for Cycling UK. So I have a UK remit. I'll just swap.
That's it. Start again, Jim.
Yeah, sorry. My name is Jim Densham. I work for Cycling UK as policy manager. So that has a UK remit. But until recently I live in Glasgow, and I'm waiting for the sort of sucking of breath when you say you live in Glasgow and you're in Edinburgh. But yeah, until recently I've been doing more focused work in Scotland, so aware of some of the Scotland issues as well as some of the UK issues too.
Okay, so I'll start with you, and then I'll come to Jodie, and I'll ask you the kind of overarching, most difficult question of all: what is a bike? What should a bike be?
Yeah, a good question. I guess legally, I'll pass this one to Jodie just because she's got a legal background, and I was thinking about this on the way here, and I'm thinking, do you know, legally, I really don't know what a bicycle is, but let's just presume a bicycle is a pedalled machine that a human powers, basically. I think one of the things I do know is that there's no legal difference between a bicycle and a cargo bike, which creates some problems potentially as we're thinking about some of these issues. That there's, in law, there's no difference between a cargo bike and a bike. So there is when you come to like electric bikes, because the EAPC regulations covers what an electric bike is. So that's probably an easier question to answer. So anything that is an electric bike should be pedalled, so you have to pedal it. You can't have a throttle. That's legal. Oh, this.
It's not strictly true, because the electric law was brought in 83-84 by Clive Sinclair with Margaret Thatcher to cover Sinclair C5. And one of the interesting things about that is it has a button throttle. It has a thumb throttle. So the law designed for that vehicle originally had an independent throttle.
Spencer, can you say a version of that into there, because Alan's not getting what you're saying?
In 83-84, when the original pedal electric laws were brought in with Clive Sinclair and Margaret Thatcher, the Sinclair C5 product that was designed to comply with that and type approved had a thumb throttle.
Okay, so that was type approved.
Yeah.
Okay, so.
And the law was brought in, it was called the C5 law at the time, or the Sinclair law, and it covers the Sinclair C5, and it has an independent pedal and drive system. So one wheel's driven by a thumb throttle, a little button you push. Not very good. I mean, you do actually have to pedal it to make it go, because it's rubbish. But the principle is it has the thumb throttle. Now, I'm a very big advocate of this because I have limited mobility down my left side. Mm-hmm. So to get a bike started, especially a cargo bike for me, the thumb throttle is the difference between standing there and doing nothing or starting to move forward. So again, for disabled people, inclusivity, it's important. But it seems we already have the law. The law was originally set up this way, and I've been stopped on my Sinclair by the police who've inspected it on a number of occasions and been very satisfied that it complies with exactly as it was manufactured.
So it seems that, legally speaking, Jodie, the law is a bit confused and a bit of a mess around what a bicycle is.
Yes, so before you even get onto the e-bike scenario, in terms of, I'm not sure there is technically a definition. It would just be deemed what the definition is. If it were ever to go to court, it would be open to interpretation in that respect. Obviously, in theory, if you go back, a bicycle is meant to be two wheels as well, which has then also been amended because you get trikes, and that is still deemed a bicycle for all intents and purposes. So I suppose in some ways, if you take it at its basic level, it's something that no one's ever had to define. Whereas now, is it something now that has to be provided a definition in legislation to say this is what a bicycle is and this is what an e-bike is? Obviously, there is some information around an e-bike in terms of restriction on power outage, speed. I know there's obviously consultation on that being looked at as well. But I suppose, as I say, it's not something until now that's ever had to be considered, because a bicycle was powered by a human. There weren't e-bikes. So as things change, as technology changes, then the law needs to catch up. But in any field, the law is always behind with what's happening.
That's not 100% true. There were three-wheeled bikes in 1880 with electric motors in the year 1900, which disappeared. So we've had electric bikes before now, and they were outcompeted by petrol cars. But that's not to say, to criticise anything you're saying. So Alex, what would you like a bike to be?
I feel that's an easier question than what is a bike. What would you like it to be? He's got off lightly.
Fun to ride.
Yes.
I think a huge part of the selling point of working for a bike delivery company is that it's an enjoyable thing to do. It's active, it's outdoors, even in the rain. It can still have its moments. I want it to be a way that people.
Talking about the physical parameters, really.
Yeah. Well, I was trying to get out the question. I'd say for us, we've used two-wheel bikes towing three-wheel trailers. So we're up at 5 wheels already, with one motor, to be clear. Although in Europe that can be done in tandem with a powered trailer and a powered bike, obviously combining to 500 watts of motor. But yeah, for us it's majoritively 2, 3, and 4-wheel bikes, which weigh as little as possible, but allowing to carry maximum load.
So, Jim,
can I jump in?
The obvious question around power.
Well, I think that to answer the question you had just said about what should a bike be, and it really should be an active form of transport. So that's the problem with the EAPC regulation changes proposed by the government, is that they wanted it to be that you can just have a throttle and a twist and go. So that stops the bike being an active form of transport. That's one of the basic problems with that potential change. So it does have some benefits for some people, but actually what we want to see bikes being is an active form of transport. Even like an e-scooter is not an active form of transport because in fact you just stand there. So an e-bike is always better. And also bikes should be something that literally anyone can just get on and use and be going faster than walking, help them get around, even be a help to people who are disabled because it can often be an aid to someone's mobility. It shouldn't have any regulations on it. So, it's just easy to do. There's no requirements to fill in any forms, but you just go and buy a bike, you use a bike, you do up a bike, and then you can ride it. So, the basic level, that's what it should be. So we shouldn't really have any, when we're talking about regulations and all the different types of bikes and different ways of getting about, the bike should always be that basic level of transport that anyone can use.
So do you think whether a bicycle is powered entirely by muscles or assisted by electric or entirely by electric makes a difference to how dangerous it is if it's got the same speed limit?
Well, yeah, because we've talked about, you can see here there's some really huge bikes, and we've already talked about those, as in large cargo bikes, and we've talked about how, more mass can cause more problems. So, again, this was one of the things around the government's EAPC regulation proposals, is they wanted to increase the size of the motor from 250 watts to the power to 500 watts. So the question there is, does this allow? It doesn't allow it to go faster because that wasn't down for changing. So we're still talking about 15.5 miles per hour. But the size of the vehicle, the more it can carry, it could get up hills faster. That was the question. So therefore, we've touched on that in terms of more massive a vehicle could cause more safety issues potentially. So that's something that really needs to be thought about, and what does that take? So that goes back to that. Should there really be a difference between an e-bike, which is, like I've said, you should just be able to get on, you should just be able to ride it, and it's an active form of transport. And if we do want these bigger vehicles, which I think we should have, we should be able to have bigger vehicles taking some other freight away from motorized transport that, companies like yours can carry. But maybe it takes these bigger vehicles to have some sort of regulation, to have some sort of driver training, to have some sort of I don't know, licensing locally. I'm not sure what that would be, but we could have a definition in future where there's larger size cargo bikes that have to have some more formal regulation compared to the e-bike and regular bikes, and even smaller cargo bikes, which you don't need to, anyone can just get on them.
So, Julie, this might be an unanswerable question, you're getting used to that, but would it take a great deal to recategorise the vehicles in law? Would there need to be a whole new act, or could this be done with small changes?
Yes and no. It would take, obviously, a large consultation to work out what it is you're actually legislating for and against, potentially, as well. The last thing we've seen that mistakes happen throughout history where legislation's rushed through and it doesn't make much sense to people. People are there, it is ambiguous. Can they do this? Can they do that? So it's certainly something that we need a lot of consultation to work out what are the parameters you're actually trying to restrict here. I think what it comes back down to is obviously the purpose for a lot of these cargo bikes is to take motorised vehicles off the road. And also, if they are being run predominantly by companies, you're reliant on the fact that these companies need to be part of that consultation. But what kind of cargo are they taking? What kind of weights are we talking about? So there is no easy fix in around all of that. And the difficulty always comes back to what we discussed before in terms of it isn't the mode of transport, it's the person that's using that. You will always get somebody, no matter what laws you have, that doesn't abide by them. And that is always the difficult. They're the ones that are going to cause the issues. And they're the ones that then have the bad press, that then has a knock-on impact to everybody else. We know there are plenty of unrestricted e-bikes already out there. We know there are plenty, sadly, cyclists that don't adhere to the rules of the road, in the same way that there are car drivers that don't have insurance, that drive recklessly. So legislation takes you so far, but is it actually protecting and doing what it is that we want it to do? Or is it just going to become more restrictive that these cargo companies, where they're just starting out, can't afford it? They can't afford to register all their bikes, even though they're trying to simply reduce emissions in city centres. So does it become counteractive what it is you're actually trying to achieve?
So is there an argument, given all the things that we think more of these vehicles could do that is good, to completely de-restrict slow vehicles?
I think that's probably taking it too far the other way. I think there does need to be restriction in place so that the bikes that we know are already illegal, they can be seized. The police have powers as and when they obviously encounter those issues. So I think taking it too far the other way becomes problematic for other reasons. But I just think are you targeting things for the wrong reasons? And I know this is completely out of context really to what we're discussing here, but obviously in terms of legislation, we know recently there's the death by dangerous cycling, death by careless cycling legislation, and it was a huge media frenzy, but actually the number of cyclists that kill pedestrians is so unbelievably small. There's legislation out there in terms of motorists killing cyclists, yet the level from 2022 to 2023 in Scotland, the number of cyclists killed rose by 250%. So legislation can only take you so far, and is it actually what the focus of these discussions should be? I would say probably not.
So I'll come to you, Jim, around the other question in the recent government consultation, which is about raising the speed limit to 20. Am I wrong in thinking that they were asking that?
Yeah, they weren't. That wasn't part of the consultation. But it is a question they probably should have asked.
I did suggest
they should have asked it because in the United States, e-bikes are allowed to go up to, certain categories of them are allowed to go up to 20 miles an hour. The statistics for death and serious injury start to climb at 20 miles an hour if you look at the danger of different speeds of vehicles. So why shouldn't we raise the speed limit to 20 miles an hour on bicycles?
Yeah, and quite a lot of people are asking that. You know, if we have 20 mile an hour zones, which, you know, are being brought in Scotland, and also, you know, we've got Wales who now have a default 20 mile an hour speed limit. You know, a lot of people are saying, well, wouldn't it be good if we could have 20 mile an hour on your electric bikes, because then you would keep up with the traffic. And there is an argument for that. I mean, I don't really see that that's a useful thing to have at the moment. I don't think we need to. What I think drivers need to do is get used to the way bikes are, rather than bikes getting used to the way drivers are. It should be that they, come down to their speed and realise that there are people going slower than them, and everyone look out for each other. In the future, there may be a case for creating differences in speeds and having different approvals on different types of vehicle. And if you ride a more powerful bike or a faster e-bike that can go at a higher speed, then you don't use a cycle lane or you don't use your shared space, because that presents more danger to pedestrians, but you could go in the road. I'm not saying that's what we should have, but I'm saying those are questions that should be asked. And that's the frustrating thing about the government consultation, in that it asked very specific questions and didn't look at everything in the round. So you couldn't think about all the different types of vehicles. You couldn't say, well, what about pedelecs that can go faster, and they're common in Europe? So, it was a very oddly questioned consultation.
And what about the other obvious way of policing and restricting this, which is already happening with scooters, which is geo-fencing all vehicles for speed limits?
Yeah, well, they should do that with cars as well, in my opinion. Okay. That's all right. So I think what we've heard today about geofencing certain cargo bikes, so that they automatically slow down. They automatically slow down when they're in a shared space. Sounds like a great idea, and but like I say, I think we should have that sort of technology for motor vehicles as much as we should for bicycles and cargo bikes.
So I'm just wondering, are we not, by focusing on the alleged danger of allowing bicycles to go faster or being driven by a throttle, are we not focusing on the wrong target in terms of danger, in terms of the need to encourage these? It's not really the main target.
No, it's okay for certain politicians or the media to get in a frenzy about these things and create a culture war, but as Jodie said, the real threat is motor vehicles. Statistics show that. So, let's have the full proper debate about these things, and decide, what sort of vehicles do we want in the future. There could be lots more cargo bikes and e-bikes and all sorts of bus bikes, all sorts of things. But we need to properly think these things through, rather than just saying, let's do a bit of legislation here and then we'll do a little bit more legislation here in a few years' time. It's not the way to do good legislation.
Coming to Alex, that's my question too. I'm going to ask you all this. To cast your mind forward to, let's say, 2030 arbitrarily, and picture what kind of transport system not are we going to have, but would be the best at that point.
Big questions.
I mean, in terms of vehicles.
Yeah. I think it's about having the right tool for the job. I think is our philosophy of this. It's that a lot of things are currently being done in unnecessarily large vehicles, and even where it is potentially efficient at the moment, HGVs are incredibly efficient vehicles in the grand scheme of things. They move a large amount of things at a reasonably efficient rate, reasonably efficient fuel economies, in a way that we don't have a great alternative for right now. Let's say intercity. It would be great if it was electric rail, obviously, to be doing those larger journeys and then coming direct into a city centre or into a consolidation point on the way in at Edinburgh Gateway, or whatever it may be, and then doing that last mile by a light electric vehicle, whether it's small vans where that's necessary, or where it's cargo bikes where possible. And then, cargo bikes themselves come in different shapes and sizes. So there'll be many jobs that are better suited to a more nimble two-wheel vehicle than a larger 3- or 4-wheeled cargo bike. So yeah, I think it's about using the right tool for the job, and our sort of residential and city town centres should. Hello. Hello. No. Oh, it's back. Oh, it's in and out.
Are you not picking us up? That's good. We can just move that too. Okay, so Jodie, I was going to ask you the same question, but with I was going to ask you the same question, Jodie, but with both you know, legally, what regulation might we need, but also feel free, as you are a cyclist yourself, what would you like to see in larger type
Centres in particular, you need vehicles that have low emissions. So whether that is a mix of obviously different types of bicycles, cargo bikes, etc., you need them to be accessible to all. We discussed earlier about people with disabilities, things like that, that it's all well and good legislating for completely able-bodied people, but you need to make sure that it is accessible to all. The whole purpose of a bicycle, for me certainly, is it is the second cheapest mode of transport beyond walking. And obviously, people can only walk a certain distance. So you don't want a market where bikes become so expensive that ordinary people can't afford them. So I think that always has to be your basic level of bicycles have to be accessible to all, whether that's financially and or the way that they're used. And I would probably just keep my answer as basic as that, because otherwise you could end up, it's a conversation for hours in itself. But I think that's what it comes down to. It has to always be accessible to all.
I'll come back to you, Jim, but we can all dive in on this one, which is how do we get there? What needs to happen, perhaps at a government level? Do we need a national conversation, an inquiry or something about the future of transport? Because it seems we're not heading for the place that we would all like to see happen. How can we do that? How can we make it happen?
I think, well, we have a chance with a potential new government at Westminster, and that's the thing that is quite hard in Scotland because all these things we're talking about, generally road laws and the different types of vehicle that are approved for use on our streets, is controlled by the Westminster government. So we have to have that conversation at that national level, unless more gets devolved to the nations. But we need to, we need to understand, what sort of vehicles we have and make them more available. There's a lot of case for saying that bicycles, especially children's bikes, shouldn't have any VAT on a children's bike. It seems a bit bonkers if you want to get, kids on bikes, and they're very expensive even to buy a child's bike. And you could say that, other bikes could also be VAT free, or there be loans. It's sad to see the Scottish government cut the funding for e-bike loans. That it should definitely have that sort of thing. But also it's about those sort of like long-term directions and incentives that government puts out, saying that this is something that we want to have, this is something that we want to make sure continues in the future, to give businesses this sort of like understanding that this is something that they can invest in for 20, 30 years. Like to have more joined up thinking about where we're going to have these distribution hubs to make that happen, because individual companies on their own, you can't do that on your own. You need councils and government to make that happen. So it takes government to do a lot of that thinking, but I'm not sure about national conversation as much as getting government to think seriously about all of these implications together as a whole, and having a strategy that it really works to, and doesn't just produce a strategy. I guess
what I'm getting at is that it seems to me that we get all of the right lip service, but what we actually need is, as Jodie was saying, the substitution of big vehicles by small vehicles in every situation where that is possible. And it doesn't look like governments understand that. I listened to a House of Commons Transport and Environment Committee, I think it was, inquiry a couple of months ago, and it was very, very uninformed. And this, this is supposed to be the decision-making body of the country, and they were saying all sorts of myths and incorrect issues and so on. And how can that be got, the right messages be got to them?
Well, I mean, that's the sort of role of all of us to keep talking to our elected politicians and saying what we want and what's important, and for the likes of us at Cycling UK to try and foster those relationships with the decision makers and MPs who will speak in debates and peers who will speak in debates, and give them the right information to be able to push government. And unfortunately, there's lots of other things as well that need to be sorted out, but this is one which we all need to keep pressing on and saying this is what we want for the benefit of our cities and for the people who live in them.
And just a last one to you, Alex. We'll come to Kim in a second to close, but around the issue of emissions and climate change and so on, obviously you use that as if you like, as a sales line for what you do. But is there a feeling amongst your rivals and operators in this space that is one of the most important messages you can be pushing to government and others?
I think so. It's definitely, it's night and day of what comes out of the back of a bike versus the back of a diesel van. I think considering how bad pollution levels are on the streets where lots of people walk, it could be a main motivator for sort of local legislators to say, let's clean up our streets effectively. I think it's the main selling point. Definitely when we're, like you say, when we're talking to customers, businesses that we work with, it's one of their top priorities, just second only to the things getting there. And
it's a pressure, it's only going to increase.
Absolutely. Obviously, it's disappointing that Scotland's emissions targets for 2030 were scrapped out of the blue. And like you say, also the sort of loan scheme for bikes completely scrapped out of the blue with no alternative or justification. Bikes, cargo bikes and electric bikes are definitely not an accessible thing at the moment, price-wise, for anyone. Incentives aren't there, funding isn't there. Support, like you said, there's a lot of lip service, a lot of really positive lip service. They really love putting a photo of a bike wherever they can. Every infographic has 6 or 7 bikes, but then when the thing gets built, there's no bike parking.
And without dramatic measures to encourage more of these, as we've all been saying, basically the target to reduce miles driven is a fantasy. Would you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we'll wind up there. Thank you very much to all our panel now. And I'm just going to call Kim Harding up, who is the author of the Edinburgh Festival of Cycling.
So I'm founder and director of the Edinburgh Festival of Cycling. Just a few thoughts on what we've been discussing. It occurs to me that quite a lot of the government changes are more to do with trying to take us away from Europe and more into line with the US, which is crazy. In Europe, speed limits are coming down, so they have in places 20 km/h speed limits rather than 20 mile/h speed limits. And you find that drivers actually stick to them. I've been through places where you've got somebody behind you and you're cycling along. They don't try to overtake you. Do bikes need to have more power? Maybe in certain circumstances, but we have in the European situation, you have the 45 km/h high-speed e-bikes, Pedal X, and they're not allowed to go onto the bike lane paths and the shared use paths. They have to stay on the road. So they're treated as a motor vehicle in that way as a scooter would be. So there is all that already there, but we're trying to go off and do something completely different and copy the people with a much higher death rate. Don't know why. It's crazy. And as we a e-bike is limited, the assistance is limited to 15 miles an hour you can go faster if your legs can go faster. So I have experience today of riding the cargo bike at 20 miles an hour with cars trying to overtake me because I'm on a bike and they don't recognize the 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. It's crazy. So we're looking at the wrong end of the telescope. We're focusing on the wrong thing. The danger is from the motor vehicles. But that's where the money is, and so that's where the big lobbying is. So, yeah, enough of the politics. Thank you for coming along. And
would you like to just say something on how this festival has gone?
the festival, it's been 5 years since we had the last one, and it's been a real struggle getting back on track. I've got one more event to do this evening, and that will be the end of it. Though we do have a pop-up event coming in July, so that there will be more going on. But yes, we're back. People seem to have liked it. They seem to like what we're doing, and hopefully people will come to more events once we get onto them, and we'll get more sponsorship next year. I know I've got one of the sponsors here. Central Scotland are one of the sponsors. So.
Okay, so thank you very much indeed for that, and we wish you best of luck for the next one.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye. Just got to the end with the back.